Okay, so in this we're going to cover dominant chords, and some of them you may not even realize you can use it. Some of the methods you may not realize you can use with, so we'll cover these, and we're going to kind of cover this in a, hopefully it's not too much information. I wrote down a few topics in front of me to cover on dominant chords, and so yeah, we'll use Notepad and we'll just kind of write out what we're going to think of. So one of the easiest things I could think of and most common is just a transition between relative minor and its relative major. They share the same chords. So the 7 chord, the 5 chord in C minor is the 7 chord in A minor. So we could do something like A minor 7 to 1 to C major, okay? To the G dominant 7 and then to C. So now let's do it musically. So I used a raised third 5 on first. Now here's our transition. So transition relative minor to major because they have the same chords in common. Natural minor. So transition between borrowed parallel minor and its relative major. This is actually very common. It's easy to do if you know how to use modal interchange, borrowing, whatever you want to call it. So what do I mean by this exactly? Well, now this is C major, okay. C minor, well, the relative major of C minor is E flat. So if I use that borrowed 7 dominant chord in C major, you could go straight to E flat. So let's take this concept. Half diminished can always go to a 5 chord, very easy in C. So let's take the borrowed half diminished 2 in C major and then transition, do the same exact move but to an E flat. And that makes it the 7 chord, the half diminished in E flat to the dominant chord of E flat. So let's establish C major. I always say make things musical when you transition. Borrowed 2, dominant. So now actually I'm going to go backwards. Since you're in the parallel minors, you can use the you can go back to the C with these with the raised third 5. So another dominant move going from parallel minors relative major. You can get to C really easy. So and backwards. So just by simply throwing in that G dominant 7. So use secondary dominants as transition chords, okay? This is kind of like a direct modulation, but let's say we'll do 5 of 3. Okay, now what you'd normally expect with a secondary dominant is that, well, we'll give an example. Something like this. Return to C, but we're not going to do that. We're not going to give the listener that. We're going to not return to C. We're going to stay in E minor. Secondary dominant. Now just stay in E minor. Go. technically it's a form of direct modulation, but I'm thinking in terms of secondary dominance. Let's go to the 2 chord. Okay, and you'd expect this if you were using a secondary dominant, something like that, and return to C. Well, we're not going to give them that. We'll go to D minor. There's our transition. So even though I'm thinking in terms of secondary dominance, I'm using that dominant chord just to go to a different key, okay? So I don't have to return to C. So now here's one you can use that is probably rarely explained. I'm sorry. You could tonicize any mode with a secondary dominant, or not a secondary, a dominant chord. So let's take the concept of the relative minor to relative major. Well, let's stay in relative minor, but go to C Lydian instead after that dominant chord. Okay? We tonicized the 1 chord of C Lydian. So let's play musically for it, with it. So I tonicized that 1 chord, but instead I chose C Lydian as the new 1. And we'll go ahead and quit there. So before, when we thought of the secondary dominance, we could use that concept of transitioning to a new mode from thinking in terms of secondary dominance. Okay, now technically it would be a direct modulation, so let's do 5 of 2, and that's what we'd expect in C major, but let's skip going back to C major, and we'll go to C Phrygian, or D Phrygian, I'm sorry. So it's kind of a direct modulation, but I'm still thinking in terms of that. Let's establish C. Now that secondary dominant sound. Now C, D Phrygian. And then we're just kind of hanging there. So we use that dominant chord that it sounded like a secondary dominant, and you expected to go back to C, but we didn't. We kind of gave an illusion to the listener that there was going to be some resolution back to C, but don't return there. So that's a good way to use secondary dominance in an unpredictable way. The point is that a dominant chord can tonicize any modes 1 or minor or major 1. So we could do a Phrygian, or not Phrygian, a Dorian. Sorry, Dorian. So we could do something like this. Now the Dorian's 4 is a dominant chord, so we could transition from that to B Dorian, etc., using it as like a 5 chord. See, C Dorian's 4 chord can also be a dominant chord, so you could do stuff like that. So we could do something like this. B flat Dorian, I'm sorry. G sharp Dorian, or A flat Dorian, and F sharp Dorian, and you could continuously do a chain like that. So the dominant shape of the 4 chord in Dorian, we could use it as a continuous transition chord to another Dorian. So it's just another instance where we can do something like that with a dominant chord. And that kind of fell into the concept of chain modulation, so we haven't covered that yet, but you could use a dominant chord within a mode to tonicize the 1 of that mode for a strong cadence to return to the 1. You could use, just like in natural minor, you could use the raised third 5 to get back to 1. So we'll do D Dorian, okay? And what's the 5? The raised third 5 of D Dorian? An A major chord, or A dominant 7th chord, or whatever. Whatever kind of dominant chord. So let's do D Dorian. Now there's that raised third 5. Raised third 5 again. So you could use it within a mode like that for a strong return to the 1.